I still remember the deafening silence of 1932, broken only by the scraping of a spoon against an empty pot. My father lost his job at the steel mill, but he never let us lose our dignity at the dinner table. With empty pockets and a full heart, he became a magician, turning scraps into feasts that kept us alive. These 18 meals weren't just food, they were lessons in survival, love, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Let me take you back to that kitchen, to taste the resilience of a generation that had nothing but each other. We called it Hoover Stew, a bitter joke about the president, but to us, it honestly tasted like survival. The recipe was simple because it had to be. Macaroni was cheap, filling, and could stretch to feed an army. Watching the pasta dance in the boiling water was the most exciting part of our day, promising a warm belly. Meat was a luxury we rarely saw. 2 hot dogs had to provide flavor for a family of 4 people. He sliced the hot dogs thin, making 2 look like 10, a magic trick born of absolute necessity and care. Canned corn provided the sweetness. We saved the liquid too. Wasting even a drop of juice was a sin. Everything went into the pot together. The starch from the pasta water thickened the soup without needing expensive flour. The pink meat, yellow corn, and white pasta created a colorful mosaic that looked far richer than it was. He seasoned it with salt and pepper, tasting it carefully as if he were a chef in a grand hotel. We let it simmer until the pasta was soft and swollen, absorbing every bit of flavor from the meat. Serving was a precise art. He made sure every bowl had an equal share of the precious hot dog coins. Watching us eat was his sustenance. In those moments, the Great Depression felt like it was happening to someone else. Hoover Stew wasn't gourmet, but it filled the silence in our stomachs and the anxiety in our hearts. One meal down, but tomorrow was coming, and he would have to perform his magic trick all over again. Nights were the hardest, but when the pantry got even emptier, Dad turned to the ultimate staple, the potato. They called this poor man's meal. It combined the 3 cheapest things you could buy: potatoes, onions, and hot dogs. Dad peeled the potatoes with surgical precision. The skins were saved for the chickens, nothing was ever thrown away. He cut them into small cubes so they would cook faster and crisp up better in the minimal fat we had. The cast iron skillet was the heart of our kitchen. A dollop of lard was the start of something good. Onions were cheap flavor. Dad used plenty of them to mask the fact that there wasn't much meat. When the potatoes hit the hot lard, the sound was like applause. The smell of frying onions filled the house. It took patience. You had to let the potatoes get soft inside before they got too brown on the outside. Once the potatoes were tender, the sausage went in. It provided the salt and the protein we desperately needed. The magic happened when the edges turned crispy. Golden brown meant flavor, burnt meant failure. Dad never failed. A splash of water and a quick cover steamed everything to perfection, ensuring no potato was left hard. Simple, greasy, and filling, it was a chaotic mix of ingredients that somehow made perfect sense together. He served it straight from the skillet. That cast iron pan was the centerpiece of our family life. There were always more potatoes than meat, but the sausage fat had coated everything in savory goodness. The sweet onions, the soft potato, and the salty meat. It was a trinity of comfort in a dark time. We ate while watching men walk past our window, looking for work that didn't exist. We felt lucky. Dad didn't speak much during meals. He let the food say, "I love you," and "We will survive this." The skillet was always scraped clean. We learned early that leftovers were a luxury we couldn't afford to leave behind. He cared for that skillet like a child, cleaning it, oiling it, preparing it for the next battle against hunger. But potatoes and hot dogs were for good days. On bad days, we had to get creative with dried beef. We called it SOS, a military term that my father politely translated as stew on a shingle. The beef was dried and as salty as the ocean. Dad had to rinse it twice just to make it edible. Water was free, thank God. He washed away the excess salt, softening the tough leather into something like meat. He tore it into tiny shreds. In 1932, we learned that small pieces made the meal feel bigger. Butter was a dream we rarely had. Usually, He used bacon grease to start the white sauce base. He whisked in the flour to make a roux. It had to cook just enough to lose the raw taste. Then came the milk. He poured it slowly, stirring constantly so no lumps dared to form in our dinner. The beef went back in, along with enough black pepper to make you sneeze. Pepper woke up the flavor. We didn't have a fancy toaster. Dad balanced the bread on a wire rack right over the stove flame. Charred toast was essential. It needed to be sturdy enough to hold the heavy, creamy sauce without dissolving. He drowned the toast in the gravy. To a hungry boy, it looked like a snow-covered mountain of comfort. It was salty, creamy, and stuck to your ribs. We slept well after eating SOS, bellies fully warm. But meat ran out. When the pantry was truly bare, Dad looked to the ground. He saw dinner in the weeds. Dandelions were everywhere. Neighbors saw a nuisance. My father saw vitamins and a free salad waiting to be picked. He taught us to pick the young leaves before they flowered. The old ones were too bitter, even for us. We made a game of it. Who could fill their basket fastest? We didn't know we were foraging for survival. The dirt was the hardest part. We washed those leaves 3, maybe 4 times, until the water ran clear. To tame the bitterness, Dad used a secret weapon, hot grease. He rendered down a tiny scrap of fatback. The fat sizzled and popped. It was the only dressing we had, but it smelled like heaven in that kitchen. This was the moment. He poured the boiling hot grease directly onto the raw greens. The sound was incredible. The greens wilted instantly, surrendering their toughness to the heat. A splash of vinegar finished the transformation. He tossed it quickly. The vinegar mixed with the fat created a warm vinaigrette that clung to every leaf. It shrank down to almost nothing, but the flavor was intense, bitter, sour, salty, and undeniably wild. It was an acquired taste for a child. But hunger makes everything taste good, even weeds from the yard. Summer weeds faded, and winter brought the deep cold. We needed something hot to hold between our hands. Potato soup. It sounds basic, but Dad's version was rich, creamy, and made without a drop of cream. He cut the potatoes into large chunks. We used every onion we had to give the broth some life. They boiled in water, just water. We saved the milk for the finish. The smell of boiling onions was comfort. Here was the trick. He mashed half the potatoes right in the pot, leaving the rest in chunks. The mashed potatoes released their starch, thickening the water into a heavy base without needing flour or roux. A cup of milk turned it white and luxurious. He stirred it gently, treating it like a delicate chowder. Salt and pepper were the only spices we knew. He seasoned boldly. Bland soup was a crime in our house. We drank it from mugs. Wrapping your frozen hands around hot porcelain was half the meal's purpose. It warmed us from the inside out. For a moment, the howling wind outside didn't matter anymore. If we had stale bread, we dipped it in. The soup softened the crusts that were too hard to chew. Simple ingredients, transformed by heat and care. It was poverty food, but it tasted like love. Dad washed the mugs, his mind already on tomorrow. What was left? A tin of corned beef and some potatoes. The square tin with the little key. Corned beef was a treat, and he knew exactly how to stretch it. Corned beef had the breakfast of champions, or at least, the breakfast of survivors. Looking back at these photos, we look thin, but we don't look unhappy. Dad made sure of that. His cooking wasn't just about calories. It was about structure. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, order in chaos. That rectangular block of pink, fatty meat was a treasure chest. It slid out with a satisfying sound. It crumbled easily. Dad chopped it fine to ensure every bite of potato would have a speck of meat. Leftover cold potatoes were actually better for this. They held their shape and crisped up faster in the pan. He diced the cold potatoes into cubes. The ratio was always 3 parts potato to 1 part meat. He mixed them by hand with chopped onions. It was a messy, chaotic blend that promised something delicious. The skillet had to be screaming hot. If it wasn't hot enough, the hash would just be mush. He dumped it all in at once. The sound of cold potatoes hitting hot grease was the morning alarm. He pressed it down hard with the spatula, compacting it into a single, solid cake filling the pan. Then, the hardest part, waiting. You couldn't touch it. You had to let the crust form undisturbed. We watched the edges turn dark brown. That crust was the prize we all fought over at the table. He flipped it in sections. The underside was a mosaic of crispy beef and golden potato. Pure perfection. To stretch it further, he cracked eggs right on top. The white seeped into the cracks of the potatoes. He covered the pan. The steam trapped inside would cook the eggs while the bottom kept getting crispier. When the lid came off, the yolks were soft, ready to burst and create a rich, instant sauce. It was a heavy meal, meant to fuel a day of hard labor or looking for work. Dad always took the smallest scoop. He claimed he wasn't hungry, but his eyes told a different story. The runny yolk mixed with the salty beef and crispy potato. It was the best bite in the world. We left the table feeling like kings, ready to face a world that didn't want us. Steak was a memory, but we had something else. A round, pink imitation that Dad turned into a delicacy. Fried bologna. Some called it the poor man's steak. To us, it was just Friday night dinner. You had to peel off the red casing. Dad always joked it was the only thing even the dog wouldn't eat. He sliced them thick. Thin slices were for sandwiches, thick slices were for dinner, meant to be eaten with a fork. He cut small slits around the edges. To keep them from dancing, he said. It prevented them from curling up. The skillet returned to duty. Just a whisper of grease was needed, as the bologna would release its own fat. When they hit the pan, the smell changed. It stopped smelling like cheap meat and started smelling like a feast. We watched bubbles rise in the middle. The texture was transforming from soft rubber to crispy, savory delight. He let them chaw. That black crust gave it a smoky flavor that tricked you into thinking it was ham. It was served simply. 2 slices of white bread and a smear of sharp yellow mustard to cut the fat. The hot grease soaked into the soft bread instantly. That soggy, flavorful bread was arguably the best part. Mustard was the only condiment we had. Its vinegar bite balanced the rich, salty taste of the fried meat. No plates tonight, just a warm sandwich in your hand. It felt like a picnic in the middle of a crisis. Hot, salty, crispy, and soft. It hit every note. We didn't miss steak. We loved this. Dad ate standing up, leaning against the sink. He always stood, ready to move, ready to work. Fried bologna night was a happy night. It was quick, it was tasty, and for a moment, life felt easy. Crumbs were swept into a hand and eaten. Even the bread crusts were too valuable to waste. But the bologna ran out, and money got tight again. It was time to return to the basics. Dried beans. Navy beans. Hard as rocks and cheap as dirt. But Dad knew how to coax a soul out of them. And the secret ingredient, a ham bone. Barely any meat on it, but full of magic marrow. Navy bean soup started the night before. Preparation was the poor man's currency. He checked the beans, turned off the light, and prayed they would swell enough to feed us all. By morning, the beans had swollen, drinking up the water. They were ready to become something substantial. He rinsed them carefully. Every stone or bad bean was picked out. Dental work was too expensive to risk. The ham bone was the guest of honor. It had very little meat, but it held the soul of the soup. Bone and beans went into the pot. Cold water covered them, promising to marry their flavors over time. An onion and a single dried bay leaf were added. That leaf had been in the cupboard for years. Once it boiled, he lowered the heat. It wasn't cooking, it was coaxing flavor out of the bone. Hours passed. The clear water turned into a creamy, opaque broth as the beans began to surrender. He pulled the bone out like a relic. It had done its job, giving everything it had to the soup. He picked off every microscopic shred of meat. Nothing was wasted. That meat was gold dust. The scraps went back into the pot. It wasn't much, but it flavored the whole batch. The soup was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. That was the sign of a proper navy bean soup. Black pepper was the only garnish. It cut through the creaminess and woke up the palate. It poured like molten lava, hot, dense, and full of potential energy for the cold night ahead. You had to be patient. Bean soup held its heat like a grudge. Burn your tongue, and you taste nothing. The texture was comforting, soft beans, smoky broth, and the occasional salty hit of ham. A pot of beans cost pennies, but it bought us a full night's sleep without hunger pangs. Sometimes, we didn't have beans. Sometimes, all we had were a couple of eggs and a lot of water. Egg drop soup. It sounds fancy now, but back then, it was a way to make 2 eggs feed 5 people. He cracked them into a cup first. You never risked a bad egg ruining the whole pot of water. He beat them furiously. The goal was to break the yolks completely so they would stream into thin ribbons. The water needed flavor, salt, pepper, and maybe a green onion from the garden if we were lucky. He stirred the water into a whirlpool. This was the critical technique. Physics was his sous chef. He drizzled the egg in a thin stream. The moving water caught it, stretching it into beautiful, golden flowers. Suddenly, a pot of plain water looked like a pot of gold. It was visual trickery at its finest. Heat off immediately. The residual heat finished the cooking, keeping the eggs tender as silk. It was light, almost airy, a stark contrast to the heavy bean soup, but elegant in its own way. The yellow ribbons floated like clouds. It was beautiful, even if we knew it was mostly water. We sipped it reverently. It didn't fill you up like potatoes, but it warmed your bones instantly. Dad watched us finish.
Daddy.
He knew it wasn't enough calories, but it was enough hope for one night. The bowls were clean in seconds. We learned to appreciate the flavor of salt and warmth. When the eggs were gone, and the pantry was truly empty, we turned to the oldest comfort of all. Bread and milk. It was a supper for children and old men. Soft, sweet, and incredibly simple. The bread had to be stale. Fresh bread would turn to mush. Stale bread held its structure against the milk. Dad heated the milk until it steamed. Cold milk was for breakfast. Hot milk was for a soothing dinner. He poured the hot milk over the bread. The hard crusts drank it up, softening instantly. A pinch of sugar was the final touch. Just enough to make it feel like a dessert, not a desperate meal. We waited a minute for the magic to happen. The bread swelled, becoming a warm, milky pudding. It tasted like safety. Soft, warm, and sweet. It was the food equivalent of a hug. Outside, the depression raged on. Inside, with bellies full of warm milk, we felt protected. But sometimes, one family's pantry wasn't enough. Sometimes, the whole neighborhood had to cook together. Mulligan stew wasn't a recipe, it was a community event. Everyone brought what they had to the big pot. One neighbor brought a carrot, another, a potato. Alone, these were scraps. Together, they were the start of a feast. Dad chopped everything into uniform pieces. He treated these donations with the same respect as prime beef. Into the pot they went. It was a game of chance. You never knew exactly how it would taste. Even the children contributed. A handful of herbs from a window box could change the destiny of the stew. It simmered for hours, the flavors melding into a rich, complex broth that belonged to no single cuisine. The seasoning was an improvisation. A little salt here, a splash of vinegar there, balancing the chaos. When it was ready, the line formed, not a line of strangers, but of friends sharing a lifeboat. The ladle dipped deep. Everyone got a fair share of the vegetables. Democracy in a bowl. The stew tasted different every time. Tonight, it tasted like turnips and camaraderie. It was delicious. As the sun set, the warmth of the stew replaced the warmth of the day. We felt less alone. The pot was always scraped clean. The last drops were soaked up with crusts of bread passed around.
Thank you kindly,
Dad
George.
thanked Mr.
We
Miller
appreciate
for the
help.
potato.
Anytime you
Mr.
Glad I
Miller
could.
thanked Dad for the fire. It was a fair trade. Community kept us fed, but sometimes we needed a treat. Something sweet to forget the bitterness of the times. Apples were a luxury we couldn't afford, but we had crackers, and we had imagination. Meet the mock apple pie. The secret was breaking the crackers just right. Halves, not crumbs. They had to mimic the texture of sliced apples. He brewed a syrup of sugar, water, and cream of tartar. It was chemistry designed to fool the tongue. Then, the magic ingredient, lemon juice. The acid provided the tartness that the missing apples couldn't. He piled the crackers into the crust. It looked dry and disappointing, like a mistake in the making. But when the hot syrup hit the crackers, They softened and swelled, taking on the ghost of an apple's shape. Cinnamon was the final disguise. The smell of cinnamon baking triggers the brain to say, apple. He sealed it with a top crust, crimping the edges. Once hidden, the deception was complete. Into the oven it went. We waited, sniffing the air. It smelled exactly like the real thing. Through the oven door, we watched it bubble. The syrup thickened, turning the crackers into a gooey filling. When he pulled it out, golden and flaky, you would swear on a Bible it was made of Granny Smith's. The knife slid through. The slice held its shape. The crackers had dissolved into soft, sweet layers. It was a masterpiece of chemistry and desperation. We stared at it in awe before taking a bite. The taste was shocking. Tart, sweet, spicy. If you closed your eyes, you couldn't tell the difference. For a moment, we felt rich. Who needs orchards when you have Ritz crackers and a father like ours? The pie vanished. It was an illusion that satisfied the soul, even if it had zero nutritional value. Sweets were rare. Vegetables were the reality. Cabbage was the king of the garden. Sturdy and reliable. Fried cabbage. It sounds plain, but Dad cooked it until it was sweet as candy and savory as meat. The secret lay in the grease jar. Bacon drippings saved from weeks of breakfasts were the flavor bomb. He fried it hard. No soggy boiled cabbage here. This was caramelized, crispy, and full of attitude. And if we ran out of fruit for pie, we still had pie. Vinegar pie, the most desperate dessert of all. Vinegar pie. It sounds impossible, but it was the poor man's lemon meringue. Acid, sugar, and hope. It cooled in the window. A testament to making something out of absolutely nothing. These recipes weren't written down in books. They were written in the muscle memory of survival. We didn't know we were poor when we ate that pie. We just knew we were lucky. But the stove never stayed cold for long. There was always another meal to conjure from the shadows. Cabbage was the backbone of our winter diet. Cheap, sturdy, and willing to wait in the cold cellar. He peeled away the wilted outer leaves. Even those went to the chickens. The ecosystem was complete. He sliced it into thick ribbons. Too thin, and it melts, too thick, and it stays tough. It looked like a mountain of food, but we knew the heat would shrink it down to a molehill. The magic wasn't the vegetable, it was the jar of bacon grease kept religiously by the stove. A generous scoop of grease hit the hot iron. It carried the ghost of every bacon strip we'd ever eaten. The cabbage went in all at once, overflowing the pan. It hissed angrily, fighting the heat. It was a battle to turn it without spilling. Dad moved with the grace of a man who hated waste. Salt to draw out the water, and a pinch of sugar to help the caramelization. Chemistry in action. He didn't steam it, he fried it hard. He wanted the edges brown, nutty, and sweet. That char was flavor. It transformed a boring vegetable into something that tasted like a main course. A splash of vinegar at the end cut the grease and scraped up the brown bits from the pan bottom. It looked dark and oily, but in the best way. It smelled of comfort and fullness. You ate it with a fork, treating it like pasta. The texture was soft but with a slight chew. It tasted sweet and smoky. With a piece of cornbread. You didn't miss the meat. Well, almost. The grease was the best part. We wiped the skillet clean with bread until it shone like a mirror. We dreamed of lemons and sunshine. We woke up to vinegar and rain. But Dad had a plan. Vinegar pie. The name sounds like a punishment. But in 1932, it was a sweet, desperate miracle. The crust was simple: flour, lard, and cold water. He worked it fast so the lard wouldn't melt. He rolled it thin. A thick crust was wasteful. A thin crust was elegant. Or so he told us. Lemons were for rich folks. We had vinegar. Acid is acid, Dad said, and sugar fixes everything else. The smell of vinegar filled the kitchen. It stung the nose. It was hard to believe this would become dessert. But the eggs smoothed it out, turning the harsh liquid into a golden, velvety custard base. He poured it into the shell. It was dangerously liquid. We held our breath as he walked it to the oven. Gentle hands. One slip and the precious sugar-egg mixture would be lost to the oven floor forever. The house smelled of butter and sugar, slowly masking the sharp tang of the vinegar cooking in the oven. It browned beautifully, A caramelized skin formed on top, hiding the humble ingredients underneath. The wobble test. It shook like jelly in the center. Perfect. Overcook it, and you get scrambled eggs. We had to let it cool. The hardest hour of my life. The smell was torture. When he finally cut it, the slice stood tall. It looked just like the lemon pies in magazine pictures. He served it with pride. He managed to find a spoonful of cream for each plate. A rare luxury. It was silky, sweet, and tangy. A poor man's lemon meringue that fooled the tongue and the heart. Dad watched us eat. His alchemy had worked. For 5 minutes, we weren't hungry, and we weren't poor. Vinegar pie taught me that sweetness can be found anywhere, if you know how to balance the sour. But sweetness is fleeting. Reality returned, and reality meant sometimes you didn't even have eggs. Depression cake. No milk, no butter, no eggs. Just chemistry and a prayer for it to rise. They also called it wacky cake, because you had to be crazy to think water and flour could taste like chocolate. But it rose, without eggs to lift it. The vinegar and soda reacted to push it toward the sky. Dad was a scientist of starvation. He proved that limitations force you to become a genius. Dessert was over. The main course of survival continued. Next up, stuffed peppers, with more rice than meat. This cake defied the laws of baking. No eggs, no milk, no butter, just pantry staples and desperation. Dad didn't even dirty a bowl. He sifted the flour and cocoa right into the greased baking pan. He made 3 holes in the mix. 1 large, 2 small. It looked like a strange ritual. Into the large hole went the oil. Fat was necessary, even if it wasn't the butter we craved. Vinegar in 1 small hole. Vanilla in the other. Vinegar was the acid that would spark the life. Then came the water. Just plain cold water poured over everything. It looked like a muddy disaster. But then, the fizz. The vinegar hit the soda, and tiny bubbles erupted. The cake was breathing. He stirred it right there in the pan. No wasted batter in a bowl. Efficiency born of scarcity. Into the oven. The best part? There were no bowls to wash. Just a clean kitchen and hope. It rose higher than seemed possible. The chemistry worked. It looked moist, dark, and rich. The smell of chocolate was intoxicating. For a moment, the Great Depression didn't exist inside our house. No frosting today, just a dusting of sugar if we were lucky. The cake stood on its own. He cut squares directly in the pan. It was moist and spongy, defying its humble ingredients. We ate it warm from the pan. Chocolate was a rare flavor, a reminder of better times. It wasn't sweet like store-bought cake. It was subtle, dense, and perfect. A small miracle. Dad savored his piece. It was his creation, his way of proving he could still provide luxury. We saved the rest. A piece of chocolate cake in your lunch pail meant you were rich tomorrow. Sweets were a distraction. The real challenge was making a pound of meat feed a family for 2 days. Stuffed peppers, nature's perfect edible bowls. Dad used them to hide how little meat we actually had. The ratio was laughable. 90% rice, 10% meat, but inside the pepper, no one counted. He cut the tops like little lids. The seeds were saved for next year's garden. Always thinking ahead. He parboiled the shells first. If you didn't, the filling would cook before the pepper was tender. The filling was a magic trick of expansion. Rice, onions, and canned tomatoes stretched the meat into oblivion. You had to break the meat apart until it was just flavor specks. Every bite needed a hint of it. He packed them tight. A heavy pepper felt like a generous meal, even if it was mostly starch. The little lids went back on. It made them look like presents wrapped in green. He stood them up like soldiers. Tomato sauce, watered down to last, was poured around their feet. They baked for an hour. The smell of roasting peppers and tomato was the smell of a fancy dinner. The peppers slumped and wrinkled, surrendering their crunch to become sweet, soft vessels. Visuals mattered.
Well, folks,
the bright red and
the
green broke
famous
the monotony
stuffed
of our
peppers.
brown and gray diet. 1 pepper per person. That was the rule. It was a self-contained meal. No seconds available. When you cut it open, the steam escaped. The rice had absorbed all the meat juices and tomato flavor. The pepper was sweet. The rice was savory. It felt sophisticated, like something from a restaurant. We talked about the garden while we ate. Eating the fruits of our labor made us feel independent. The burnt tomato sauce on the pan edges was the chef's treat. Dad scraped it off and smiled. But some nights, there was no garden, no meat, and no energy. Just burnt bread and milk. Milk toast. It was food for the sick, the old, and the broke. We were often all three. It wasn't just milk on bread. Dad made a white gravy, seasoning it heavily with pepper to hide the blandness. The sauce softened the harsh, burnt crust. It was a study in contrasts, black and white, crunch and cream. I still eat milk toast when I'm feeling low. It tastes like my father's hand on my shoulder. He toasted the bread over the open flame until it was dark. The char added flavor to the bland flour. It clattered onto the plate, rock hard. You couldn't eat it dry without breaking a tooth. He made a roux with a tiny knob of butter and flour. This was the base of all comfort. He poured in the milk, stirring rhythmically. It thickened into a glossy, white blanket of sauce. Pepper was crucial. He added enough to make it spicy, waking up our tired taste buds. The hot gravy hit the toast. We watched the hard bread soften and surrender to the warmth. We ate it wrapped in blankets. It was heavy, warm, and coated your stomach against the hunger pangs. It was soft food, like baby food, but in a hard world. Softness was exactly what we needed. Dad ate quickly. He needed the energy. The next day, he would walk 10 miles looking for work. We licked the bowls clean. Milk toast wasn't fancy, but it felt like a warm bath for the soul. But desperation breeds creativity, and sometimes, creativity gets weird, like the time Dad combined onions and peanut butter. Peanut butter stuffed onions. I know, it sounds like a mistake, but back then, it was protein. The Bureau of Home Economics actually recommended this. Dad decided to trust the government one last time. He hollowed out the onions. It was precision work, creating a vessel for the strange filling. They were boiled until soft. The smell of boiling onions was the perfume of the Great Depression. The filling was peanut butter mixed with breadcrumbs, a sticky, dense paste that would stick to your ribs. He stuffed the onions. It looked wrong. Brown goo inside white bulbs. We watched with skepticism. Into the oven to roast. The idea was to caramelize the onion sugars to match the nutty filling. We waited. Surprisingly, the smell began to change. Roasted nuts and sweet onions. It wasn't bad. They came out golden brown. The peanut butter had melted slightly, oozing out of the tops. It was the main course. A singular roasted onion filled with peanut butter. A monument to survival. The knife slid through easily. The layers fell away. We took our first bite with hesitation. Sweet, savory, creamy, and weird, but it was hot, and it was food. We ate it all. Dad laughed that night. If we can eat this, he said, we can survive anything. He was right. 18 meals. Some were delicious, some were strange, but all of them were miracles. Looking back at that empty kitchen, I don't see poverty anymore. I see my father's love. He didn't just fill our stomachs, he filled us with the belief that tomorrow would be better. I would give anything to sit at that wobbly table one more time and eat his potato soup. We didn't have money, we didn't have much food, but we had Dad, and that was enough. Dedicated to everyone who cooked with nothing but hope. Their recipes are our history. What is the cheapest meal you remember from your childhood? Share your story below. I read every comment. Let's keep these memories alive before they fade away forever. Don't forget to subscribe for more tastes of history. Next week, rations of World War II. Good night, everyone. Stay hungry for history.